I'm Margaret Holloway, 71 years old, and on a cold Thanksgiving afternoon, I sat at my son's table with a pen in my hand, signing a paper that would quietly change the ground beneath me. Across from me, Melissa's smile stayed fixed, the kind that looks warm if you don't notice the eyes. Andrew stood near the window, watching the bare trees sway, not looking my way. The words on the page said I would never ask for their help, not for care, not for support, now or in the future. I signed without hesitation, my fingers steady, my mind trying to keep pace with my heart. That moment, as simple as ink on paper, would echo far beyond the holiday table. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand your ground in a place you once called home, go ahead and like and subscribe. I was born in a small town in Ohio, the kind where you knew the name of the man who fixed your roof and the woman who baked your birthday cake. My parents believed in keeping your word, in setting aside for a rainy day, in never taking more than you needed. Those lessons stayed with me. I married Daniel when I was 22, a man who could measure twice and cut once without ever raising his voice. We built a life in a modest 2-story house with a wide porch and a vegetable garden out back. And even when we didn't have much, we kept our accounts balanced and our cupboards full. When Daniel passed 2 years ago, the house felt too large and too quiet. Then last month, I tripped on an icy curb and fractured my hip. Andrew and Melissa insisted I stay with them while I recovered. They said it would be easier than me trying to manage alone. Their house was modern, all glass and pale walls with scented candles that smelled of eucalyptus, and a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. It was nothing like the warm clutter of home. Thanksgiving was my 3rd week there. Melissa set the table with folded cloth napkins shaped like birds, small pumpkins lined up down the center. Andrew kept his phone in hand, scrolling between bites. After the plates were cleared, Melissa brought out a beige folder. No label, just smooth cardboard. She called it a formality, something their attorney suggested a voluntary waiver of support. She said it was symbolic, that it simply confirmed my independence. Andrew didn't meet my eyes. I signed, and she folded the paper neatly before sliding over the sweet potato pie, as though we'd just exchanged recipes. No one spoke of it again. That night, I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic room. They'd given me the heat, barely reaching the corners, my space heater humming beside the bed. I told myself it was temporary, that families helped in different ways, that some changes were just adjustments. But deep down in the quiet of that cold room, I wondered if I had just agreed to something I didn't yet understand. The morning after Thanksgiving, the house felt different. I woke early, careful with each step as I made my way down from the attic room. The air was cooler than usual, the kind that settles into your bones. When I reached the hallway, I stopped short. The bookshelf Daniel had built decades ago was gone. It used to stand against the wall, filled with his aviation books and my collection of handwritten recipe cards. In its place was a tall mirror, framed in white, with a wicker basket beneath it, holding neatly rolled yoga mats. Melissa passed by with her earbuds in, moving toward the kitchen without a word. Her new routine seemed to involve green smoothies and a blender that roared loud enough to shake the cabinet doors. Andrew was nowhere to be seen. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting lightly on the wall, where the bookshelf had been before, turning back toward the stairs. Later that week, I noticed the study door propped open. Inside, the room was unrecognizable. The desk Daniel and I had shared for years was gone. In its place were ring lights, weights, and stacks of foam blocks. Posters lined the wall, each printed with phrases like "choose joy" and "mind over matter." It was Melissa's filming room now. The familiar scent of paper and old wood had been replaced with lavender spray. The changes came steadily after that. One afternoon, I came down for tea and saw that Daniel's armchair had been moved to the garage. Melissa mentioned it casually, saying the chair looked dated and they wanted to freshen things up. I nodded without comment. A few days later, the quilt from the guest room disappeared, replaced by a gray throw that matched the rest of the house. Family photos vanished from the mantel, replaced with a ceramic sculpture and a flickering battery candle. I started keeping track without really planning to. In the kitchen, I found an old spiral-bound notebook tucked in my apron pocket and began jotting things down. Monday bookshelf, gone. Tuesday hallway rugs replaced with foam tiles. Wednesday coat hooks removed. Thursday wedding photo from the mantel missing. The list grew quickly, each entry short and simple, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. The small items mattered most. My mother's pecan pie recipe, which had always been kept in a tin box on the kitchen shelf, was no longer there. When I asked about it, Melissa said the shelf had been cleared to make space for a ceramic Buddha and a scented candle. She spoke in the same pleasant tone she always used, the one that gave no space for argument. As the days passed, I began noticing other things that weren't as obvious at first. Melissa had stopped calling me by name. Instead, she referred to me as Andrew's mother when talking to delivery people or her friends on speakerphone. Andrew, for his part, had grown quieter. If I entered a room, he would look down at his phone or find a reason to step away. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat in the attic room with the space heater humming at my feet. I looked over the notes in my spiral-bound book. The pages were smudged from where my hand had rested while I wrote, but the words were clear. I turned to a fresh page and wrote at the top in large block letters, "Erasure log." The act of naming it gave me a strange sense of steadiness. I began recording more than just objects. I noted how the air vents to my room had been closed, how the scent in the hallway had changed from coffee in the morning to Melissa's essential oils. I wrote down the way Andrew's gaze slid past me and the way Melissa's smile never touched her eyes. The first real crack in the quiet came one gray Tuesday afternoon. I was halfway down the stairs when I heard Melissa's voice from the kitchen, sharper than usual and carrying through the open space. She was on the phone, her words clipped. "By spring, it'll all be in our names," she said, followed by a laugh that had no warmth. "She won't see it coming. Andrew's finally on board." I stopped moving the wooden railing, cool under my hand. She went on mentioning something about transferring full ownership and letting go of dead weight. I stayed there listening until her voice dropped low again. Then I turned and went back upstairs, my steps soundless on the carpet. In the small drawer beside my bed was an old voice recorder Daniel and I had once used during tax season to keep track of client notes. I pulled it out, tested the batteries, and slid it back into place. For the first time since arriving here, I wasn't just keeping a record in my notebook. I was ready to keep their words, too. That night at dinner, Melissa talked about launching a new online program and hinted at taking out a home equity loan for renovations. Andrew nodded while cutting his chicken. I ate quietly, watching the two of them talk around me. When Melissa asked if I wanted dessert, I declined. The attic room was cold again when I went to bed. I wrapped myself in the quilt I'd brought from home and sat with the erasure log open on my lap. On the new page, I wrote Day 51. Overheard conversation about full transfer, both parties in agreement. Intentional. The words looked steady on the paper, each letter deliberate. I didn't know yet what I would do with the recorder or the notes. But I knew this: I would not let the record be lost. Even if the walls, the rooms, and the air itself shifted to erase me, the truth would remain written down. And that truth was growing line by line in the quiet of the attic. One quiet morning when the house was still, and the only sound was the faint hum of the furnace, I decided to go through a box I hadn't touched in years. It was tucked in the far corner of the attic closet behind a stack of old holiday decorations and folded blankets. Daniel had given me that tin box a year before he passed, telling me it was just some paperwork he didn't want in the safe. At the time, I didn't think much of it. He was always organized, always keeping duplicates of important things in unexpected places. I set the tin on the bed and eased off the lid. Inside was a stack of manila folders, each one labeled and typed. Daniel's neat handwriting marked the margins in places precise and steady the way he used to draft his work notes. I expected to see bank statements or insurance papers. Instead, I found 2 decades of investment summaries. The balances were higher than I remembered. There were brokerage accounts in my name, retirement funds I hadn't thought about in years, and bonds spread across several banks. At the bottom of the stack was a spreadsheet printed just 3 years before his death. Across the top in bold was my name. Every column was neatly aligned IRAs, municipal bonds, trusts, all listed under my ownership. One account was with a financial firm in Connecticut. I didn't even recall opening yet. The paperwork showed my signature and proper filings. Daniel had moved everything into my name, gradually starting in the late 90s, each transfer documented and notarized. I counted the total more than once, my eyes moving down the page carefully. $77 million. It didn't seem possible. Alongside the figures was a short letter, folded neatly, addressed simply to Margaret personal. In his even script, Daniel wrote that life was unpredictable, that if I ever found myself alone, I should know he had planned for that. He wrote that this wasn't a gift, but recognition for what we had built together, and that the resources should give me the freedom to live without fear. I sat there for a long time, the paper spread out across the bed, the winter light catching the edges of the folders. I thought of all the evenings he had spent in his home office, the way he'd quietly close the door and work at his desk, while I baked or read in the living room. Now I understood why he had never seemed anxious about the future, why he had never pushed me to return to my old job at the accounting firm after we started our family. When I had put everything back in the tin, I found a new place for it, behind a row of dusty cookbooks in the attic's far cabinet where Melissa was unlikely to look. Later that evening at dinner, she spoke about rebranding her business, suggesting they might need a home equity loan to make certain renovations. Andrew nodded absently. I listened without comment, but the weight of what I knew stayed with me. The next morning, I walked down to the living room and noticed another change. The oak bookshelf from our first house, the one that had held tax manuals and gardening books, was gone. In its place was a white bench with 2 rolled yoga mats stacked neatly on top. I stood there, with my hand on the wall, as if the memory of that shelf might still be there. Melissa passed by on her way to the kitchen, her earbuds in the blender starting up moments later. Over the next few days, more small things disappeared. My blankets from the linen closet were replaced with rolled white towels. The framed photographs from my attic room were gone. Even the old pillow with my initials stitched in the corner was missing. In the kitchen, the refrigerator was covered in Melissa's printed schedules and fitness calendars. On the counter was a quote in bold letters, "Let go of what no longer serves you." I made tea and sat at the far end of the counter, my spiral-bound notebook open. I began to write down each thing that had vanished, every wall that had been repainted, every piece of my presence replaced. Monday bookshelf gone. Tuesday hallway rugs replaced with foam tiles. Wednesday coat hooks removed. Thursday, Daniel's photo from the mantel missing. It was the recipe box that stayed in my mind the longest. I had kept it on a shelf near the microwave for years. Inside were handwritten cards for our holiday dishes, pecan pie from my mother, cornbread for Christmas morning. One evening when I reached for it, the shelf was empty. In its place sat a ceramic Buddha and a battery candle. Melissa came in as I was looking through the cabinets. Her tone was even, but it carried a finality I had come to recognize. I nodded and went back upstairs without another word. That night, I wrote a new heading in my notebook, erasure log. I listed not just the missing objects, but the subtle changes, the lavender spray in the hallway. Melissa referring to me only as Andrew's mother, the quiet that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Late one night, I stood by the front window. From there, I could see the living room below. Melissa had created a meditation corner with bamboo plants and a salt lamp where Daniel's recliner once sat. I thought of him there reading the newspaper, our dog asleep at his feet. None of that remained. I went back to my attic room and opened the tin box, not to count the money, but to remind myself of what was unshakable. The accounts, the trusts, the investments, all in my name. I added a line to the log before I put the notebook away. They are unaware I am the storm they are quietly sweeping out. The days that followed stayed quiet, but my awareness had shifted. I began to see each change not as an isolated update, but as part of something deliberate. And with every note I added to the log, the outline of what I needed to do next became a little clearer. The morning after the first snow, the house was unusually still. I stood in the upstairs hallway, one hand resting on the railing, the other tucked into my sweater. Downstairs, I could hear Andrew's footsteps moving toward the kitchen. He paused for a moment when he saw me through the open guest room door, but whatever words might have formed never left his mouth. He just nodded once and kept walking. Melissa appeared not long after with a stack of rolled blueprints. She spread them across the dining table, circling areas with a red marker. Her voice was light as she pointed to spaces she wanted to modernize. I noticed my attic room outlined in bright red. She called it future meditation space. My name wasn't mentioned. I kept walking, but the image of that red circle stayed with me. That evening, I opened my leather-bound notebook, the one Daniel had given me years ago, and turned to a clean page. At the top, I wrote erasure log, day 47, and carefully described what I'd seen. I added small details, Melissa's hand resting on Andrew's shoulder as she spoke, the pause in his expression before she circled my room, the word permanent mentioned more than once. The next morning, I tried to start a conversation. As Melissa came in from her early run, I set a mug of tea on the counter and told her Daniel had once dreamed of building a greenhouse in the backyard. I mentioned the spot by the fence where the sunlight was best. She didn't look up from her protein shake. She mumbled a short acknowledgement, then moved the cup aside to wipe down the counter. The moment passed in silence, but I noted it that night. Day 48, suggestion ignored, conversation closed. By the end of that week, I noticed boxes stacking up in the garage. Each was labeled old keepsakes in bold marker. Melissa had hired a home staging consultant to help declutter. Inside those boxes were more than objects. They held Daniel's handwriting on yellowed receipts, the smell of his pipe lingering in his wool coat, and the creak of the wooden chair he always sat in before heading out the door. I knew if I didn't act these things, these pieces of our life would disappear for good. One quiet afternoon, I pulled a flash drive from my desk drawer, one I had bought months before. I began scanning old letters, tucking each digital file into a folder labeled with the date and a short description. I noted the texture of the paper, the smell, and Daniel's careful script. Some of the letters were decades old, folded and refolded until the creases had worn soft. In one, from March of 1984, he'd written, "If they forget our love, let it be because we kept it too sacred to display, not because we let it fade." I read that line twice before saving the file. It was late on a Tuesday when I heard Melissa on the phone again. I was halfway down the stairs when her voice carried clearly from the front hall. She was laughing not warmly but sharply as she told someone, "By spring, it'll all be in our names. She won't see it coming. Andrew's finally on board." My hand tightened on the railing. She mentioned transferring full ownership, spoke of letting go of dead weight. I moved back up the stairs without making a sound. In my attic room, I opened the drawer where I kept the old voice recorder Daniel and I had once used. I switched it on, the red light blinking steadily. I set it near the edge of the dresser, angled toward the hall. That night, I wrote Day 51. Audio recorded conversation, captured intent, confirmed. At dinner, Andrew sat across from me, his focus on cutting into his chicken while Melissa talked about a new client. I studied his face, searching for any trace of the boy who once ran to me in the middle of the night after a nightmare. If it was still there, it stayed hidden. When the meal was over, I went to my room and pulled an envelope from the back of the closet. Inside was a business card I'd kept for years. It belonged to Daniel's closest friend, Gary. After Daniel's funeral, Gary had offered to help with any legal matters, saying I only had to call. That evening, I did. I spoke quietly, explaining the forms I'd signed, the changes in the house, and the recording I had just made. When I finished, he said, "You're not imagining this. It's deliberate." But Daniel prepared for this. We can still act. We agreed to meet the next morning at a coffee shop in town. It was small and warm, with the smell of fresh bread drifting in from the bakery next door. Gary sat in a corner booth, a folder already open in front of him. I slid the recorder across the table. He listened without a word. When it clicked off, he said, "She's setting up for a transfer under marital property law. But if we move now, we can shift your holdings into a private trust. We'll name it after Daniel. She'll never touch it." He explained that Andrew wasn't legally tied to my accounts yet, and that the key was to use their overconfidence against them. His calm, measured tone steadied me. Before we left, he handed me a folder with a checklist of what to gather: account statements, ownership documents, proof of Daniel's transfers into my name. I tucked it into my bag and buttoned my coat. Back at the house, I went straight to the attic and placed the tin box, the ledger, and my erasure log into a suitcase marked winter clothes. It slid easily under the bed. Later, Melissa asked if I wanted to join her for a workout. I declined, smiling just enough to keep her at ease. That night, with the space heater humming, I made a quiet promise to myself. The next time Melissa circled a room on a blueprint, it wouldn't be mine to lose. 2 mornings after meeting Gary, the weather turned damp and gray. I walked into the kitchen to find Melissa at the table, a stack of papers in front of her. She smiled faintly and said these were just small updates to keep household responsibilities and medical decisions organized. I didn't answer right away. I pulled out a chair and sat across from her, letting the silence settle before I looked down at the pages. They were neatly formatted with my name in several places and lines for signatures. When I reached for a pen, I wrote my name in the margin instead of the space she indicated. It was just enough to make it clear I wanted a copy before signing anything further. Melissa blinked quickly and said she'd need to check with Andrew before giving me one. She gathered the papers, her movements a little too quick, and left the room without another word. Later, when the house was quiet, I went to the alcove off the attic where my boxes had been stored after the move. Beneath a stack of linens, I kept an accordion folder labeled Legal and Quiet. Inside were the first documents Melissa had asked me to sign in November, along with notes in my handwriting describing the circumstances. I added a line about today's exchange. Her words, my request for a copy, and her refusal. That night at dinner, conversation stayed light. Melissa talked about repainting the guest room and rearranging the sunroom for her yoga recordings. Andrew mostly kept his eyes on his plate. After the dishes were done, I checked the kitchen trash. Beneath some shredded mail, I found a printed design layout labeled Holloway Home Renovation Plan, Phase 2. My name wasn't mentioned anywhere in the notes. The following afternoon, Melissa left for a photo shoot, and Andrew stayed home working from his office. I knocked on his door to ask if he had the papers from the day before. He hesitated before saying he wasn't sure what I meant. I nodded, thanked him, and walked away. In my room, I opened the drawer where I had hidden the voice recorder. I replaced the batteries and tested it, then slipped it into my cardigan pocket. That evening, Melissa came into my room with her usual polished smile, offering to help upload my Medicare forms. As she spoke, I pressed the recorder's button. Most of what she said was routine until she mentioned she had already filled in some of my preferences for the advance directive. She laughed lightly as if it were nothing, but the details stayed with me. After she left, I saved the file and noted it on a new index card date subject, and the fact that it had been discussed before permission was given. Over the next week, I kept my pace steady. I didn't refuse outright when Melissa floated new ideas about the house or paperwork, but I didn't agree to anything either. Each time I recorded the interaction and wrote down the details. The erasure log now had dates, quotes, and supporting audio. In a separate envelope, I kept copies of forged documents Gary had pointed out, along with sections from Daniel's ledger showing clear proof the assets were mine. One rainy morning, I met Gary at Doy's Diner. We took the booth near the back where the hum of conversation was low, and the waitress knew to give us time. I slid the envelope across the table. He reviewed each page and listened to the recordings without interruption. When he finished, he said the evidence was strong enough to act. We would move my holdings into the Joseph M. Holloway Foundation, quietly using a shell trust at first so it looked like small portfolio changes. Once complete, the transfer would be irreversible. Gary laid out the plan in careful steps. The foundation would fund scholarships, elder care programs, and literacy grants, things Daniel had quietly supported for years. It would bear his name, keeping both the assets and his legacy intact. Melissa and Andrew would have no claim to it. I signed the initial paperwork with one of Daniel's old pens, the nib scratching softly against the page. When I returned home that afternoon, the house was empty. I boiled water for tea and sat at the kitchen counter, making lists in my notebook. One page for legal tasks, one for people who could be allies if needed, neighbors, church friends, former colleagues. Another page listed every item of mine that had been moved or removed since I arrived. I didn't need to explain the reason for these lists to anyone. That evening, I prepared dinner before anyone came home. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans with lemon. When we sat down, conversation stayed polite. Under the table, I slid a folded slip of paper to Andrew. He glanced at it, then at me, before tucking it into his pocket. It was my new mailing address for the foundation. I didn't speak about it, and neither did he. After dinner, I listened to the quiet hum of the house. Melissa was in her studio upstairs, and Andrew was in the den. The suitcase under my bed held the tin box, the ledger, and my notes, each labeled and ready. I had what I needed to move forward. The only thing left was to wait for the right moment to bring the plan into full light. One morning in late March, I came downstairs to find the mantel stripped bare. The photograph of Daniel in his service uniform, the folded flag, and the rosewood box holding his wedding ring were gone. In their place sat a framed quote about renewal and a small jade plant in a white pot. Melissa was adjusting pillows on the couch, humming softly. She noticed my glance at the empty mantel and said the house needed to breathe, that too much nostalgia held back new energy. She mentioned she had packed everything neatly into a labeled storage bin. Then she left the room without waiting for my reply. That afternoon, I discovered more changes upstairs. The quilt from my bed had been replaced with a gray coverlet that matched the rest of the house. The lace curtains were gone, swapped for blackout panels. On the shelf where the anniversary clock once sat, there was now a diffuser and a stack of self-help books I didn't recognize. In the closet, the scarves Daniel used to bring me from small towns on his work trips were missing. I found them later in a donation bag in the garage. I took back a pale blue silk one patterned with tiny yellow flowers and folded it into the pocket of my cardigan. That evening, I set a single photograph on my nightstand, a picture of Daniel and me under a maple tree the summer after he retired. He had his arm around my shoulders, both of us squinting against the sunlight. No one seemed to notice it the next day, though. Melissa paused briefly in the doorway while walking past with a laundry basket. I didn't look up from my book, and she kept moving. A few days later, I overheard Melissa speaking from the study. Her voice was bright and professional, and an unfamiliar male voice responded with clipped businesslike answers. She was discussing the house titles, ownership percentages, and how quickly things could be finalized. My name was mentioned as a formality, nothing more. The man on the other end said the paperwork could be ready by the end of the week if all signatures were secured. When she stepped into the hall and saw me standing there, Melissa smiled as if the conversation had been casual. She said they were exploring options and gestured toward the living room. Minutes later, Andrew appeared with a folder saying a notary was on the way to handle routine updates. I asked what kind of updates. He hesitated, and Melissa answered that it made sense for the home to be in the names of those actively maintaining it. I asked if that meant removing me. She didn't respond, only tapped the pen against the signature line. I stood slowly telling them the house no longer felt like mine, something I had quietly known for months. I picked up one of the documents and recognized the phrasing from contracts Daniel had once shown me, the kind used to transfer ownership without direct consent. I told Andrew that silence at this moment would make him complicit. I told Melissa that every part of this house had held something Daniel and I had built together, from the bookshelves to the porch swing, and no paperwork could erase that truth. I left the folder on the table and walked upstairs. In the drawer beside my bed was the flash drive holding copies of every financial record, property deed, and investment account in my name. It also contained the foundation's formation documents Gary had prepared. I updated my notebook with the date the attempted transfer, and that consent had not been given. At the bottom, I wrote in capital letters, "I am still here." The next morning, I asked Andrew to drive me to Gary's office. We rode in near silence. I thanked him as we pulled into the parking lot, not for help, but for showing me exactly how much had changed between us. Inside, I handed Gary the notebook, the flash drive, and the most recent audio files. He opened his legal pad and began noting what he would file first. That evening in my room, I sat with the quiet. It wasn't the cold quiet of being ignored. It was the steady quiet of knowing what needed to be done. My notes were complete, my evidence labeled, and my course clear. From the hallway, Melissa's voice carried up the stairs as she spoke into her headset. I reached for the recorder and pressed the button. The red light blinked as her words came through plans for altering my medical documents. A mention of consolidating ownership for tax benefits, and the suggestion of pushing through a revocation of next of kin rights on cognitive grounds. She even used the word frailty. When I played the recording back later, each word was sharp and clear. I added the file to the flash drive, then typed a letter to Gary confirming the timeline for the final asset transfer to the Joseph M. Holloway Foundation. Melissa and Andrew's names were nowhere in those papers, and once filed, the trust would stand beyond their reach. The next morning, I mailed the final documents from the post office near the old grocery store. The clerk joked that it looked like I was sending a novel. I told her it was a kind of story. That afternoon, I walked through the backyard and saw the first yellow tulips pushing up near the fence, the same color Daniel had painted our garden bench years ago. I made one more recording that evening, marking it as my final thoughts before the legal execution of the transfer. The morning of the signing was overcast, the kind of pale gray sky that seemed to muffle sound. I stood at the curb outside the church fellowship hall, Daniel's wool coat folded neatly over my arm. Gary was already inside the foundation documents arranged on a long table draped in a white runner. Beside the papers was a framed photograph of Daniel and a vase of fresh marigolds. Andrew and Melissa arrived together. She walked quickly, her heels striking the floor with sharp precision, her shoulders squared. He followed a step behind, his gaze fixed on the ground. Neither of them spoke to me as they took their seats across the table. Gary began by reading aloud the mission of the Joseph M. Holloway Foundation. His voice was calm and steady, each word carrying clearly in the quiet room. He explained the Foundation's purpose-funding scholarships, elder care programs, and literacy initiatives before detailing the legal structure. He stated plainly that all assets formerly in my name had been transferred into the Foundation's custody irrevocably and without any family member from the Holloway household listed as a beneficiary. The air seemed to tighten. Melissa folded her arms and kept her face still. Andrew leaned back, eyes closing for a brief moment before opening again. Gary continued reading the final provision that the property on Maple Hill Lane would be vacated within 30 days and repurposed as the administrative site for the Foundation. At that moment, 3 women entered from the back of the hall. Cheryl May and Doreen Friends, who had quietly supported me through the past months, each carried something small. Cheryl placed the first grant approval letter for a recipient in Wisconsin on the table. May set down the official nonprofit registration certificate. Doreen lit a single candle beside Daniel's photograph. Melissa's eyes followed the movements, but she said nothing. Andrew glanced toward me, his lips pressing together, as if he were about to speak, but no words came. Gary signed the final page of the transfer documents and handed me the pen. I added my signature slowly, each stroke deliberate. When I was done, I set the pen down and looked at the 3 women beside me. "Thank you," I said quietly. It was all that needed to be said. We didn't linger after the signing. The candle remained lit as the room emptied its flame steady in the still air. I walked toward the door without looking back. Outside, the gray sky hadn't changed, but the weight on my shoulders had shifted. At the end of the driveway to the house, my suitcase waited by Doreen's car. I paused once before getting in my eyes on the upstairs windows where the morning light used to stream in when Daniel and I shared coffee. The blinds were drawn now, but I could still picture it. In the side pocket of my coat was a letter Daniel had written for my 65th birthday. The paper had softened over time, but the handwriting was unchanged. In it, he wrote about the small bookshelf we built together one summer, about how I always checked every account twice. His last line read, "Do not let them define the love you lived." I folded the letter carefully and tucked it away again. The house behind me no longer felt like home, but the life I had built with Daniel was mine to carry forward. As Doreen started the car, I kept my gaze ahead, knowing that what I had preserved would outlast the walls I was leaving behind. I stood at the end of the driveway, my suitcase by my side, Daniel's old wool coat folded carefully over my arm. The house behind me looked quiet, even though Andrew and Melissa still lived there. The windows upstairs, once filled with soft morning light as Daniel and I shared coffee, were now dark, the blinds drawn tight. I didn't feel sadness. Instead, I felt a kind of release, something inside me loosening after holding so tight for so long. I unfolded a letter Daniel had written me on my 65th birthday. The paper was worn, the ink faded slightly, but his words held their shape. He wrote about the bookshelf we built together and how I always checked every statement twice, the way numbers never lied. His final lines stayed with me. "Do not let them define the love you lived." I pressed the letter to my chest and tucked it away again. The house was no longer my home, but the life I had built within it would never belong to anyone else. As I walked away, Doreen waited in her car, ready to drive me to whatever came next. I glanced back once, not to say goodbye, but to acknowledge what I was leaving behind. There was no bitterness, no anger, just the quiet closing of a chapter I had written with my own hand. Ahead, there was space I could choose for myself, a life without cold rooms or quiet erasures. I carried the warmth of memories that no one could take away. The foundation I helped create would support others like me, women rebuilding, reclaiming, and remembering their worth. If you've ever felt invisible in a place you once called home, or silenced in a family you helped build, know this: your story matters. Your memory has weight. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest truths, and like me, you have the power to reclaim them. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, I invite you to share your thoughts or your own journey in the comments. And if you've been here before, feeling unseen or unheard, remember, you are not alone.